BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Mondays, I talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, an unidentified serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And in this episode, I will be discussing the murder of Paul Stine, the Zodiac's final confirmed victim, responding to the Consult podcast, and looking at the film While the City Sleeps from 1956 for possible Zodiac Killer clues. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Blackbox Ned. And of course, I would like to let you guys know that this episode is partially sponsored by Michael Cole, a friend of the show and author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy. This series explores the Zodiac case in depth. It covers the facts of the case in Volume 1, fact-based speculation in Volume 2, and the third volume ties it all together. You can get this anywhere true crime books are sold, and if you like it, please give Michael a 5-star review. And first, I would like to give a shout-out to Irish Brummy, who left a comment on last week's Zodiac Monday, and he said, would I be interested in doing an episode about one of the victims, because so much focus is given to the Zodiac Killer, is put on the Zodiac Killer, but we don't talk about the victims nearly enough. And I think that that is an excellent idea. So that's what I'm going to do in this episode and focus on the murder of Paul Stine, although I will be talking about the Zodiac Killer's actions and activities, and I will be talking a little bit about the other Zodiac crimes, but I do think that this is a good opportunity to discuss the murder of Paul Stine, and I've wanted to do a Paul Stine episode for quite some time, because, again, I wanted to finish the Consult podcast. I actually got through their first 3 episodes. They have a 5-part series on the Zodiac Killer, and they talked a lot about the murder of Paul Stine, and I also wanted to finish the Time Life Collective, which is a series of stories related to the Zodiac Killer that I began at the beginning of the year, and I went through Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, and Lake Berryessa, but I did not respond to their material on the murder of Paul Stine. But if we're going to do this as a tribute to Paul Stine, first, let's say some things about him. He was born Paul Lee Stine on December 18th of 1939 in Exeter, California. And there is a website out there, it's actually Ancestry.com, that was saying that he was born in 1940, but Paul Stine was 29 years old at the time, and his birthday was on December 18th, so he should have been just shy of his 30th birthday. He should have been 29 years old, and Ancestry.com also stated that his birthday was January 18th, but I believe that's also correct. Paul Stine's birthday was famously December 18th, which is quite similar to a Zodiac Killer suspect named Arthur Lee Allen. But Paul Stine was approaching his 30th birthday. He was studying for his Ph.D. in English, and to support himself and his wife, he drove the taxi where he was murdered. But I've also read that Paul Stine sold insurance. He had 2 jobs, and he was a Ph.D. student, and he was supposed to graduate with his Ph.D. in English in the spring of 1970, so he was very close. Paul Stine was also known to have been somebody who worked with university newspapers, a reporter, and if we're going to say something praiseworthy, I think that this is perhaps the most praiseworthy thing that I can say. Growing up and becoming an adult is realizing that Paul Stine was a badass, and the Zodiac Killer was nothing but a puny human being. Paul Stine was working hard to support himself and his wife. He was trying to study to become a better person. That stuff is amazingly commendable, and the Zodiac Killer is the exact opposite. The Zodiac Killer was somebody who had some type of emotional damage, and he decided to project it onto society in a destructive purpose. What could have stopped the Zodiac Killer from doing what Paul Stine was doing? Working hard, getting married, getting a Ph.D. What could have stopped him? His own arrogance and his own his own insignificance and refusal to admit that he was insignificant and try and improve. Instead, the Zodiac Killer chose a pathway of destruction. And guess what? Nobody other than maybe one person truly knows his name. So, to continue onward with this episode, I would also like to look at some things about the actions and activities of Paul Stine and what was happening on the night of October 11th, 1969, when the Zodiac Killer was in his taxi and we went to Presidio Heights. And to help us out, we're going to go over to the book Anthrax to Zodiac by Denise Diana Huddle. Longtime listeners of Black Box Online Radio will know that I've referenced this book a lot in the recent months because it's one that I first started talking about in regards to the Anthrax Killer, Anthrax to Zodiac. Denise Diana Huddle covers several different subjects in her book, and she also talks about D.B. Cooper, the Black Dahlia, and the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, all of which are stories that I've covered here on Black Box Online Radio. So I've been talking about her book a lot recently, but she has a section here on the Stein killing, Death of the Scholar Cabby. 29-year-old graduate student Paul Stine was scheduled to receive his Ph.D. in English from San Francisco State in 1970. The San Francisco State English Department was at the epicenter of the longest strike against an academic institution in U.S. history. Paul Stine drove a taxi part-time to support himself and his wife while he was in graduate school. On October 11th of 1969, at around 9:45 p.m., Paul Stine picked up a fare at Mason and Geary in the Tenderloin in a yellow cab, number 912. The passenger directed Stein to an address in the prestigious Presidio Heights neighborhood, located a little over 3 miles away from the southeastern corner to an army post, the Presidio. At the northeast corner of Washington Street, at the intersection of Washington and Cherry, Stein stopped the cab and the passenger shot Stein once, in the head, behind the right ear. After Stein's body was discovered, the meter on his taxi was running, and it had a fare of $6.25, showing at 10:46 p.m. The taxi company and police interpreted this information from the meter to mean that Stein had picked up the killer on his way to the 9th Avenue assignment, which is another assignment that Paul Stine would have had. He was supposed to go to 500 9th Avenue, apartment number 1, but he picked up that fare on the way. So that suggests that this was not planned, that this was not an arranged meetup. And I think that if this had been some type of reservation, there would have been more evidence, and we would be talking about that much more clearly. But instead, this seems like something that would suggest that the Zodiac was just waving down a cab, and Paul Stine was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, we have 3 witnesses to the murder of Paul Stine, and there are actually going to be a lot more than 3 witnesses, but we have a section in Denise Diana Huddle's book called The 3 Kids in the Window. 3 teenagers were watching the scene from the window of the house, directly across the street, approximately 50 feet from where Stein's taxi was parked. They reported never hearing the shot, but watched as the killer sat in the front passenger seat of the taxi, doing something they interpreted as rifling Stein's pocket. And on a recent interview that Michael Cole did with Ross Geraci of Planet X Filmworks, they were talking about the story of whether or not one of the witnesses, Lindsay Robbins, could see the glint of the knife that was used to cut Paul Stine's shirt. And that was a story that Lindsay Robbins told Jim Dean when he interviewed him, and then the information was then passed on to Mike Rodelli for his book In the Shadow of Mount Diablo, or I should just say, for the entirety of Mike Rodelli's research. Jim Dean was heavily involved with that, and Lindsay Robbins did say that he could see the glint of the knife, but strangely, Jim Dean didn't even recall that particular detail. When he saw the transcript, he said something to the effect of, "Yeah, that's me, those are my words, that's how I phrase the questions," but he didn't even remember Lindsay Robbins saying that, but it appears that it's possible that they could see a knife being used, and to me this suggests that shows intent. That shows that the Zodiac really wanted to get a piece of Paul Stine's shirt. Why? To prove that he could commit the murder. Although once we get to the console podcast stuff, we're going to talk about a lot of speculation in regards to how the Zodiac committed the murder of Paul Stine. In fact, the killer cut pieces of Paul Stine's shirt and took his wallet and taxi keys. And, of course, famously, it appears that the killer may have made a mark or an incision to start the cut, and then it was actually torn and ripped in the rectangular shape, according to all other sources. The witness watched as the attacker wiped down the inside of the taxi with a white cloth before exiting the front passenger's door, walked around where he wiped off the exterior of the car, and then casually walked down Cherry Street toward the Presidio. Alright, so what does this really say? What is this really showing? The Zodiac is wiping down the exterior. Why would he do that? What benefit would that be? And we were talking about this a lot last year on the panel discussion show. And the panel show is one where we had the opportunity to share some different ideas. And we were like, was the window truly up or was it truly down? Because if the window were up, then there would be absolutely no benefit for the Zodiac to walk around to the driver's side and wipe anything. He shouldn't have touched the outside of the driver's side for any reason if he got into the car as a passenger. Could this be what the Zodiac Killer said in the letter, that he was leaving false clues to fool the authorities? Is he just smearing stuff around? And if anything, this also shows that the Zodiac is breaking from character and he is lingering at the crime scene. This might be a bold statement, but this might be the only example of a incident in Zodiac activity where the Zodiac lingers at the crime scene. You might be thinking, well, with the Lake Berryessa stabbing that happened 2 weeks before, he stood there and he talked to Brian and Cecilia for an extended period of time. Isn't that lingering? No, not after he committed the stabbing. He stabbed the victims and he walked away. And he just didn't start, rummaging through their items. They offered him the keys and some money. He left it all behind. The Zodiac stabbed them and walked away. With the murder of Paul Stine, the Zodiac is very clearly lingering at the crime scene. Now, why would he do that? Well, we're going to find out. Overall, though, if you want to read Denise Diana Huddle's book, she has a very lengthy section that is dedicated to the Zodiac Killer, but it's very, very basic. And if I can just provide one additional note to something that's outside of the Stein murder, I found that the only real takeaway or piece of value or interesting aspect of this section in the book was when she was discussing something that happened after the Stein murder. Paul Stine is murdered on October 11th of 1969. More than a year later, the Zodiac would mail the Halloween card that has the two skeletons and the pumpkin and the spider web, and it also has the very odd symbol which most people believe came from the Red Rider comics or the Red Rider coloring book, but she was actually proposing that that could be from a weather station, and that is a combination of symbols that were used in a weather station, and even the two dots that are above the flying V symbol, which some people call the cattle brand, I call it the flying V, but even the two dots could actually represent a symbol for rain. So it seems like there actually is, a defendable case that's why the Zodiac Killer chose to use that symbol. And also, the arms of the flying V are a modified version of the weather station symbol. One could be the symbol for 10-knot wind, and another could be a symbol for 15-knot wind. And outside of everything else that I've read, those were the main points that I would use to take away from her book, and I found that those were the most interesting parts. But I would love to know what you think about anything in regards to the comments that I've made about the murder of Paul Stine so far. But I do have a couple more announcements for you guys, because this is the Zodiac Killer News Report. And I just mentioned the panel discussion show briefly. That came out on the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, which was something that we did mostly last year. We did a couple episodes this year, but there will be a new Zodiac Killer segment on the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, hosted by Jerome from Belgium, Mr. Belgique, and it will be called This is the Zodiac Speaking, so please look out for that one. And there will also be a new Zodiac Killer panel that is coming out on the channel Zodiac Theory, which you can hear on YouTube, and the name of their panel show will be The Chronicle. It will be a monthly panel discussion show that you can hear, once a month, monthly, and the first episode will come out on September 21st of 2025 to anybody who's listening to this live. And if you're listening to this at a future date, please feel free to check out the panel discussion show, The Chronicle, on the YouTube channel Zodiac Theory. And please, like and subscribe to all the previously mentioned channels here. Now, I told you guys that I wanted to talk about the Consult podcast, and they did a multi-part series in the spring of this year, and I went through the first episodes and talked about them on Zodiac Monday, and the first one was very ordinary. The second one was ordinary. The third one was ordinary. Not really a lot of groundbreaking discussions. Yeah, there are a few interesting ideas, but I wasn't necessarily blown away. But I had always remembered that they had done a fourth episode, and they actually ended up making a fifth one, a bonus episode. Like, I will tell you firsthand, once you get started in the world of examining the Zodiac Killer's mystery, for lack of a better term, it's difficult to get out, and it seems that a lot of people are experiencing something similar. But part four was absolutely excellent because they just kind of got down to the point. And they just were talking about what they genuinely thought about the Zodiac Killer, as opposed to just spending 50 minutes telling the story of a single crime scene. They were like, okay, well, what was the Zodiac Killer doing? What was the Zodiac Killer thinking? Why did the Zodiac Killer make these choices? And the Consult podcast is one that is hosted by former FBI profilers, and they had Michael Butterfield on as an expert guest to discuss the facts of the Zodiac Killer case. And there are multiple panelists, and one of them, I didn't necessarily like too many things that were said, so I'll just share her comments real fast. She said some basic stuff about how, well, the Zodiac Killer committed crimes in Vallejo, California, such as the Blue Rock Springs shooting and the Lake Herman Road murders were close to Vallejo, not in Vallejo, but close by, and he wrote the word Vallejo on the car door at Lake Berryessa. So I think he lived in Vallejo, and he was somebody who went fishing regularly at Lake Berryessa. And I was just thinking, whoa, whoa, whoa. How on earth is that sufficient evidence to unify everything that you said? And her co-panelist said all of that. He's just like, wait a second. There is insufficient evidence to say that the Zodiac Killer lived in Vallejo or that he lived in Presidio Heights where Paul Stine was murdered. There is just insufficient evidence for that. And ultimately, of course, I agree with that. To those of you who have followed Zodiac Monday will know that I agree that we do not necessarily know if the Zodiac was choosing these locations because they were close to his home, or was there a different reason? And the guy from the Console podcast said very clearly, this could have all been done by planning, mapping. He thought that the guy would have visited the crime scenes ahead of time, or at least knew about their locations. I don't necessarily think you would have to sit around at Lake Herman Road too much to get a feel for the area. It's a gravel parking lot / turnoff area on the side of the road, but to know of its whereabouts, all of that could have been done with mapping, so I agree completely. Now, this is the way that they thought the Zodiac Killer would have operated, that he would have been somebody who really hated authority, as evidenced by his comments in the letters where he is regularly insulting police officers, calling them pigs, calling them blue meanies, the fact that he wants to get on television, they did bring that up, but the television guy was most likely a hoaxer. How about the fact that he wants to get his name in the paper? That was the real Zodiac. He wants to contact the lawyer Melvin Belli with the Dear Melvin letter. He wants people to wear his Zodiac buttons. He doesn't only want media coverage, he wants to become the media himself. And this was driven by a hatred of authority, extreme insecurity, and also that it was driven by a grudge. And I'm like, this is continuing so nicely with some of the discussions that I've had in the past on Zodiac Monday, because Dr. Ann Burgess, who is the author of A Killer by Design, said all of that stuff. Serial killers who write letters have a grudge. That was a commonality among 23 serial killers that she studied that wrote messages. They had a grudge. They are mad at someone or something who has cheated them out of the success in life. And they felt that they had been denied these opportunities for some reason. The opportunity to strive, the opportunity for greatness, the opportunity to be better than other people in an outward way. And I'm like, all right, this is all really, really starting to make sense. That's the type of person that the Zodiac Killer would have been. And also, he would have been a psychopath. That was mentioned as well by the Console podcast. In the past, I had a more general view where I said something similar to Dr. Todd Grande when I was like, okay, narcissist, absolutely. Psychopath, I'm not sure. Yes, absolutely now the Zodiac Killer was a psychopath. He just treated the victims, especially Paul Stine, as just objects where he's just tossing them around. With Paul Stine, he's able to just rummage through his things. He's getting the keys in the wallet, which I believe he was trying to stage it to make it look like a taxi cab robbery, but absolute indifference to Paul Stine and any of the other victims. That's another point. Now, in regards to the murder of Paul Stine, if this is the Paul Stine edition, they were like, why would the Zodiac Killer commit a crime in Presidio Heights? And again, there are multiple participants on the console podcast, and one of them said, if this is true, that this is a guy who felt that he had been denied his opportunities in life, perhaps he chose the Presidio Heights location because it represented something that was what he could not obtain, a wealthy neighborhood, a prestigious neighborhood, and I really, really appreciate what they're doing there. Think about how all of that stuff is laid out. Okay, this is a guy who's not rich, he didn't really do the best in life, and he can't have a nice house like that or something. So that's why he wants to commit the murder in that particular location. All right, I totally get it. However, I also have to play the insufficient evidence card. I don't see anything in the Zodiac's letters that indicated that he was jealous of that, and I'm only going by the facts. I know that they can tie things together in that particular way, and it makes a little bit of sense, but that's just one possibility. What if the Zodiac Killer chose Presidio Heights because he wanted to line points up on a map? What if the Zodiac Killer chose Presidio Heights because it had a very clear exit pathway to the bridge that went to Sausalito? What if there is another reason? So just saying that he did this because, okay, this is a guy who's not very rich and this is a prestigious neighborhood and he is envious, I really didn't find that to be the most convincing explanation. What do you think? Let me know in the comments section down below. Now, on to the next point. This is one that I think is a little bit harder to digest because, as I said, they have multiple participants on the console podcast. One person is saying, what I just said about the wealthy neighborhood, and another person thought this is the type of guy who might have committed the murder of Paul Stine as a envious killing. He might not even have been super envious of Presidio Heights. He was envious of Paul Stine. Could this not mean that the crime was unplanned and that Paul Stine started talking to him in the taxi? And it relates to everything that I said at the beginning of the episode. Paul Stine saying, oh yeah, I'm married. I'm going to get my PhD in English next year. I'm going to be Dr. Paul Stine. And he's talking about these accomplishments and his hard-working life, and he has 2 jobs, and he's trying to pay for him and his wife, and they're just going to try and start a happy family or something like that. And this guy thought, this man is living the life that I wanted. This man is more successful than I am. He's a taxi driver, and he's already doing better in life than I am. And the Zodiac killed him out of envy. Could that actually be something that happened? I would put that in a less likely category. Why do I say that? There must have been some reason why the Zodiac wanted to go to Presidio Heights. I mean, what other reason did the Zodiac have to be in Presidio Heights? Maybe he was going to his cousin's birthday party or something like that. But in terms of choosing to go to Presidio Heights, the Zodiac said very clearly that he wanted to go to Washington and Maple in Presidio Heights. So what would be the rationale for saying that this was completely unplanned? Paul Stine was just talking about stuff. Paul Stine also had somewhat of a similar appearance to the Zodiac Killer, minus the mustache that he had when he was 29 years old. And the Zodiac shot him because he was envious. I think that is less likely than choosing the neighborhood, but I still have to say that the only things that we know is that the Zodiac murdered Paul Stine, he wiped down the cab, stole the items, and he walked away. All right, what does that indicate to us? What does that show us? That shows that the Zodiac got away with it, and I think that he got away with it because of an exit strategy. So you can hear me out. What do you think about this? The likelihood of these events and scenarios. Why did the Zodiac Killer commit the murder of Paul Stine? Number 1, the exit strategy, the benefits of the location. And number 2 would be plotting on a map. And I do mean that he had some type of course that he had mapped out or some reason why he had chosen these points on the map. That's the second most likely. The third, that he is envious of the people of Presidio Heights. They are rich and he is not. And the fourth would be that he killed Paul Stine out of envy. If you want to challenge me on these likely motives for the Stein murder, please put them in the comment section down below. And also, I'm going to mention an honorary fifth one that we're going to talk about with the movie While the City Sleeps, because there actually is something that is discussed in that film. So, moving on to the next segment, in terms of what the console podcast was talking about, this is a very bold statement that was made by one of their profilers, and I also would love to know what you guys think about this. What someone on the console podcast was saying, I think the Zodiac was educated, but I don't think he had a lot of education. I don't think he had anything more than a high school diploma, or let me rephrase that to say it in a more honest context. There is no evidence from the Zodiac Killer's writings and activities that he had any more education than a high school diploma, and I was just shocked. I mean, I was just thinking, goodness, I mean, that challenges so many people out there. Let's say Gareth Penn, who wrote the book Time 17, who was saying, well, if the Zodiac Killer actually put all this stuff together, he would need a PhD, or at least a master's, some type of graduate-level education. Other people have proposed Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, as a suspect, who not only had a PhD in mathematics, but he also had an extremely high IQ of around 160, and they were like, no, there's no evidence of anything more than a high school diploma. Even me, somebody who's just, responding to the case, I've at least thought that the Zodiac was a university graduate. I wouldn't be shocked at all if he had a master's degree or a PhD, but just to say he only had the education of a high school graduate? Okay, so here's the rationale for that. Number one, the Zodiac misspelled words, right? And they were like, I don't think the misspellings are intentional. The console podcast stated that they did not believe the misspellings were intentional because the Zodiac is so narcissistic and full of himself that he wouldn't put these errors out there consciously. He wouldn't want people thinking that he was dumb. So what he would do is just write out the letter, not really pay too much attention to that, because he had never had to write papers in a university setting. He never had to pay attention to spelling in a university setting. So that's why he has a high school education, but not a university education. And I'm like, all right. I was giving you guys so much credit. I mean, these observations about how the Zodiac has a grudge against somebody and he didn't commit the crimes arbitrarily. I'm completely on board with that. That stuff makes perfect sense to me. And I do genuinely believe that this wasn't just, hey, look, there's a movie about a serial killer. I could be a serial killer too. I'm going to be a serial killer. No. I genuinely believe the Zodiac Killer was committing crimes because of some type of childhood trauma that was unresolved, or just some type of childhood abuse. The console podcast agreed about that. They also agreed that there's a specific grudge against a specific entity. I agree completely too. I can't tell you what that is. But just to say that the evidence they're putting forward that the Zodiac didn't have a university education was no misspelling, or the misspellings, and he's not spell checking, he's not trying to get things right. I mean, there could be so many other possibilities. Furthermore, I know I said this once recently, but I have to come back to this. The Zodiac was someone who couldn't spell the word Christmas right. The word Christmas, he would put two S's at the end. And also, when he wrote the Melvin Belli envelope, he said Merry Xmas, and he misspelled the word Merry and the word Xmas. I mean, I completely agree with the statement that he didn't want people thinking that he was dumb, so he almost inserted additional misspellings to overcompensate for the fact that he couldn't spell. I mean, spelling is hard for some people, even me. So, I mean, it really seems like he knew how to spell words, but then he just inserted additional misspellings to confuse people, overcompensating for this fact, and it also adds the air of mystery. It adds this type of enigmatic event where people are going to be talking about it until the day they die. Now, they asked a question to Michael Butterfield, and I thought he gave a very interesting answer. And that is, do you think that the Zodiac Killer was alive in 2007 when David Fincher released the movie Zodiac? Well, let me rephrase that. In 2007, the famous movie Zodiac came out with Jake Gyllenhaal and Mark Ruffalo and Robert Downey Jr. And did the Zodiac live that long? And if so, why didn't he write about it in a letter? And Michael Butterfield actually gave a pretty good response when he said, well, I don't know if he was alive at the time. but it makes perfect sense as to why he would not write a letter. And they're like, well, why is that? And he said, if the Zodiac Killer were to write a letter in 2007 saying, something about you finally got someone good to play me in a movie, something to that effect, then it would exonerate so many individuals. Let's say, how about Arthur Lee Allen, the person who's featured in the Zodiac Killer movie, the Zodiac from 2007? He's featured ad nauseum in that movie. He would be completely exonerated if the Zodiac wrote a letter in 2007, because Arthur Lee Allen died in 1992. All the suspects who passed away before the 2007 letter came out would be exonerated. I mean, we're talking about people like Ross Sullivan, Richard Gaikowski. Sullivan died in 1977. Richard Gaikowski died in 2004. Earl Van Best. I mean, all of these people who had passed away would just be completely eliminated if the real Zodiac Killer wrote a letter that was authenticated to everyone's satisfaction in 2007. So somebody in the Zodiac's position wouldn't want to do that. That would be a ridiculous move. It would take all the focus off of Arthur Lee Allen and put it back on the real killer, and he might actually get captured. And the Consult podcast likely agreed, because, again, these are the stories of real FBI profilers, and one of them was saying that he was interviewing a man whom they knew was the serial killer, and he was dying of cancer in prison, cancer of the mouth, and it was extremely painful. And they just wanted the story. They were just like, all right, just tell us what you did, how you did it. Now's your chance to tell everything. This man is literally just on his deathbed, and it's his chance to talk about his biggest accomplishments. And the guy refused. And the only explanation that they could see was this was the type of person who would want to keep everything to himself because they were his treasured memories. So they was something that was important to him, and he wanted to take his motives to the grave. Now, they didn't identify the serial killer exactly, but they just said someone who was dying of cancer in the mouth in prison, and he just wanted to go back to his cell and didn't want to talk to the FBI. So, would the Zodiac Killer be in that position? I think so. I think so. And they were also asking the question, would the Zodiac Killer be the type of person to keep the trophies, the Lake Berryessa hood, maybe the bloody knife, Paul Stine's wallet, the piece of Paul Stine's bloody shirt, and Paul Stine's keys? Is that just in a box somewhere in somebody's attic? I have to lean toward yes. The only way I could think of the Zodiac destroying those items would be that if this is just a hyper intelligent person and he is just like, this stuff's going to get me caught, it served its purpose, now I'm going to destroy it. But I really lean toward the Zodiac being as emotional and concerned for his own feeling as he was, holding on to that stuff in a box. And when I said the word emotional, I mean emotional for him, not for other people. I think the Zodiac Killer was a psychopath, but probably somewhere in the state of California, there's a locked box in someone's attic, or maybe in the basement, and it's just filled with these Zodiac Killer items. Something like that's in a safe with a really tricky combination that only the Zodiac would figure out. Oh, well, maybe the combination is 10, 11, 69. Maybe it's something that's so simple that's just hiding in plain sight, because that's another form of power tripping all the same. So, we have some challenge questions already in this episode, and I'll just repeat two of them. One of them is, do you believe the Zodiac Killer kept his Zodiac Killer items? I've given you several examples. The Lake Berryessa hood, the knife, the wallet and keys of Paul Stine, and the bloody shirt piece. Do you believe that he kept those or he destroyed them? I just have to lean toward him keeping them. And I would also really love to know what you think about that statement that the Zodiac only had a high school diploma. No, I shouldn't say no university education. They said he did not graduate from a university. That is in their profile. That is their statement. It's an educated guess and so on. It's just what they think about the Zodiac based on the evidence that we have. Let me know what you think about that and put your ideas in the comments section down below. And right now, I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts. You can support this channel at buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxonlineradio, and this allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out here on Zodiac Monday. And our first one comes to us from Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. Batman bought you a coffee. I never get tired of saying that, and Batman66 just gives the thumbs up seal of approval. And our next one comes to us from River Prawn Pottery, another regular and consistent supporter. Thank you as well, River Prawn Pottery. And of course, we have CZ Guy, another regular and consistent supporter. You three have been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for your weekly contributions to Black Box Online Radio and Zodiac Monday. And we have another regular and consistent supporter as well, who is mostly here, and that is Classic Chevy Cat, who says, "Love the show with you and Vincent on the New Cokes channel." That's responding to a recent interview that I did on New Cokes 2024. Or I guess the channel's name is just New Cokes, and New Cokes with Vincent McConnell. "Just the discussion causes me to crave more on Zodiac. Did you see Tom Voigt's comment on that episode? What is your response? Thanks so much, Ned." And Tom Voigt's comment on the New Cokes channel was, when Vincent and I were discussing the Bates had to die letters. Sherry Jo Bates is a possible Zodiac Killer victim who was murdered in 1966. And in the spring of 1967, they had the 3 Bates had to die letters that were mailed to places in Riverside, including Sherry Jo's father. They were sent to multiple destinations. And what Tom Voight stated is that the 2016 hoaxer who came forward and claimed that he had fabricated those was checked out by the police, who was determined not to have been the Zodiac and not the murderer of Sherry Jo Bates. But they did not actually verify whether or not he wrote the letters. They simply took his word for it. My response is, that seems to be correct. I mean, I've heard that from all sides of the discussion, that there are just so many. I mean, everybody is saying that the authorities simply accepted that those letters were from the hoaxer without actually verifying it. And I'm shocked. I think you can tell, like, how stunned I am that that appears to have been what happened. When I read that for the first time, I thought it was a mistake. I thought it was wrong. I was just thinking, you know what? How on earth can they just accept somebody's confession? If I write a letter to a police station, say, "Hey, yeah, I'm the person that did that prank on that other thing," are they just going to accept and be like, "All right, well, we'll take your word for it," and then proceed with the legal consequences? I mean, you might be thinking, well, why would somebody lie about that? Why would somebody admit to hoaxing letters? People lie about things all the time. If I had to bet my life on it now, I'd say that that person actually did it, but I am just truly shocked at the investigative abilities of RPD. So let me know what you think about the 2016 hoaxer who claimed to have fabricated the Bates Had to Die letters. And thank you so much to everyone who has supported the channel on buymeacoffee.com. You can also use the super thanks here on YouTube. And feel free to check out some of the other content here on Black Box Online Radio. I would like to give a big shout out to everybody who listened to my most recent episode on the disappearance of Maura Murray, which came out over the weekend. I had the opportunity to interview Tim Wallace, a researcher who has followed that case, and we talked about all things related to the Maura Murray investigation. That was just a bonus episode and a one-off. The interview is about 1 hour and 40 minutes long, and in regards to some of the more contemporary content that is coming out, on Tuesdays I'm doing a regular segment about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. On Wednesdays, of course, about Jack the Ripper. On Thursdays, I've started Dahlia Thursday, talking about the Black Dahlia murder. And of course, on Fridays, talking about D.B. Cooper. So lots of content here on Black Box Online Radio. And from time to time, a bonus episode might appear. And, once again, you can always give your ideas for future episodes. Now, moving onward. Because this is the Paul Stine edition, I have to give credit to Drew Beeson, who shared this story with me once, and that is that he actually met somebody and got in touch with them who knew both Paul Stine and Paul Avery, and he knew the reporter who covered the Zodiac case the most and the final Zodiac Killer victim. And I was asking Drew, like, is this some type of conspiracy theory, or is it just that California is a small world? And he said, California is just a small world, but the description that that person shared about Paul Stine is just, he was simply the nicest guy in the world. And I really get the feeling that that's true, because that's what all the stories of Paul Stine are about. And think about what I've said in regards to him is that, he was hardworking, he worked on his university newspaper, he was an aspiring member of academia, he was somebody who just wanted a better life. And this really goes to show you that not only the Zodiac Killer, but all serial killers are just absolutely deplorable and sickening. And last week on the channel, I told you guys that I had started the book Zodiac Lives by Rhoda de Torre, and it told the story of a woman named Monica, whose 3-year-old daughter Jennifer appeared to just be recalling something that she shouldn't be able to remember, stating that she was murdered in the Presidio, saying the word Presidio over and over again. And in this novel, Jennifer falls to the floor, her face turns white, her lips turn blue, and they take her to the emergency room. And then they actually begin to explore the possibility that she might be the reincarnation of a Zodiac Killer victim. And what I said on last week's episode was, well, a victim with a connection to the Presidio, I wonder who that could be. And I did provide the condition that Paul Stine was murdered in Presidio Heights, not in the Presidio. So maybe they were going to say another victim like Diane Louise Jerish, who was the victim of the Black Sapphire murder in 1965. But this book, Zodiac Lives, took a very different turn, and instead, they were saying that it's possible that she is the reincarnation of Lorraine Rehak, R-E-H-A-K. And I had never heard of that story before. I tried to see if this is actually based on a real crime, but they just said that she was a woman who worked at the Golden Gate Diner. I couldn't find anything about a woman named Lorraine Rehak working at the Golden Gate Diner. It might be a fictitious additive for the story, and that's totally fine if somebody wants to do that in a novel. I'm a little bit surprised that, they're going to write a Zodiac Killer novel and insert fictitious victims. And again, I searched for this person, and I could not find her by name. Maybe they'll provide some additional information. Part of me is still thinking that this story's going to come back to Paul Stine, but while I was reading the book Zodiac Lives by Rhoda de Torre, there are these two characters. There's Monica, the mother, and her sister, and the sister says, hey, you know what? We should really try to find out who this Zodiac Killer victim is that your daughter is talking about. This is our chance to be Nancy Drew. And the mother says, whoa, now wait a second. This isn't just a case. This isn't just a mystery. I'm trying to find out what's wrong with my daughter. And I think that that is so telling about the true crime world. I remember back in 2015 that I heard a YouTuber named Kaylee Elise say that we always have to remember that the victim is a human being, not just part of the case. And I just think that that speaks volumes about how people approach true crime cases. Some people are only in it for the problem-solving aspects, and they overlook the fact that they are dealing with real people. Yes, of course, they're consciously aware that they're talking about the stories of real people, but the emotional connections are not there. The sensitivities and recognition of human life are not there. And I think that we can do both. We can want the answers. We can want to know who the killer is, but we can also be respectful to the victims and think about their humanity. And the next thing that I have for you here on the Zodiac Killer News Report is continuing with the discussion on the Time Life Collective. I made it to part 4 of the Consult podcast, and I thought now is a good time to also discuss the content in the Time Life Collective and look at their comments about the Presidio Heights murder, the murder of Paul Stine. So this actually begins with Lake Berryessa, and it says, the next interval was shorter. 2 weeks after the Zodiac killed Cecilia Shepard, Zodiac murdered again. He chose his victim at random, but also he was now in the city of San Francisco. At 9:30 p.m. on the evening of Saturday, October 11th, Paul Lee Stein was waiting for a fare in the cab rank of the renowned St. Francis Hotel near Union Square. The 29-year-old Paul Stine was studying for a Ph.D. in English at San Francisco State and needed all the part-time taxi money he could. Not that he particularly cared for driving a cab. 5 weeks before, he had been robbed by a couple of armed men, and that worried Stein's wife, and she hoped that he would take care of himself. The theaters in the Union Square area were gorging, smiling, and they had chattering patrons, and a stream of yellow taxicabs flowed through the streets, and Stein responded to a radio dispatch for an address on Ninth Avenue and pulled away from the curb. But the masses of the people slowed everything down, and the traffic was just inching along. Stein halted when a stocky man flagged him down and came forward to the window. The man gave an address that was not too far from the North Avenue call on Washington Street at Maple, in the section of a place called Presidio Heights. Its principal landmark is the Presidio, the headquarters of the U.S. Sixth Army, which sprawls over 1,400 heavily wooded, park-like acres, and would require a quick detour to take the man to his destination. And I think that everything is, all in line with the other sources, that Paul Stine was on his way to a different fair, but he had an opportunity to take someone along the way so that he can get more rides, he has more customers, more money, more business. I think that that goes without saying, and I also don't think that there's anything suspicious about that. Now, as far as this detail here about how it was a foggy night, I've read in the past that that was a fabrication by Robert Graysmith, and it was actually a rather not exactly a clear night, but it was not foggy, and the fog wasn't just surrounding everybody like the London of Jack the Ripper, so to speak. But Stein waved him into the back seat of the cab and quickly jotted down the address on his trip sheet and started to roll. Ah, now we have a problem. How on earth do we know that Paul Stine was sitting in the back of the taxi when he could have been sitting in the front seat? About 10 minutes later, the cab arrived at the Washington Street address, and for some reason, perhaps the passenger changed his mind at the last minute. Stein drove a little farther down the street to the corner of Washington and Cherry. Why did he do this? We do not know. The dark, fog-shrouded grounds of the Presidio were 2 blocks away. Zodiac leaned forward, swung his left forearm around the cab driver's head and yanked it back. Stein clawed frantically at the encircling arm, but though he was a well-muscled 180-pound man, he could not loosen the embrace, and he had but a second or two in any case, and the Zodiac jammed a 9mm semi-automatic pistol against Paul Stine's head. He jammed it against the cabbie's right temple and pulled the trigger. There was very little sound. Stine's had absorbed most of the muzzle, and the blast, as heavy, copper-coated slugs exploded into his skull, fragmenting into 3 pieces that made pulp of the brain tissue. 2 of them exited on the left side of his head and dropped to the floor, and the other onto his clothes. The third ripped through what the anatomists and coroners called the zygomatic arch. And as for this here, there was a discussion that I heard on a different podcast where some people were saying, how was the Zodiac able to do this without being covered in blood? How was the Zodiac able to commit this crime without getting blood not only on his skin but also on his clothes, his face? Because you guys all know about blood spatter, and if you don't, you can watch the show Dexter. But, of course, when you shoot somebody in the head, there's blood spatter, right? And the blood should go everywhere, right? Well, I have seen a video or 2 of people being shot in the head on the wonderful and sometimes horrible internet, and in those videos, it really doesn't look like the blood explodes out unless they're shot with a specific caliber. If somebody were shot with, say, a 9mm, the bullet would go in, and the profuse bleeding doesn't start immediately. So what it seems like the Zodiac did was he shot Paul Stine in the head, and then he pushed his body to the floorboards so that he wouldn't get blood on his clothes, which shows that we're dealing with a very methodical and very smart perpetrator. Maybe not a genius, I'll give the Console podcast that, but a very smart perpetrator all the same. But what do you think about any of the comments mentioned by the Time Life Collective? And right now I would like to talk about the movie While the City Sleeps. And I have to give a shout out to Michael F., who sent this in to the email address blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and he said, While the City Sleeps, 1956. Not too specific to the Zodiac, but I'm sure you'll see the crossover elements. Comic books, escalation to a daylight attack, newspaper coverage. Actually, it would have been interesting if the San Francisco Chronicle treated Zodiac more like the newspaper in the movie. Would the case have gone differently? Would Zodiac have instantly faded away after the Blue Rock Springs shooting, knowing that the San Francisco Chronicle was coming after him and calling him a psycho mama's boy? Possibly a movie the Zodiac saw in the theaters or on TV as a rerun. After your mention of the sniper in last week's Zodiac Monday, I figured I'd offer another for Ned's next Movie Monday. Keep up the great work, Mike F. And as you see, this is also one that was shared and requested by one of the listeners. So if you have any ideas, you can put them in the comment section down below or send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I also want to be very clear about something. I'm well aware that it's quite probable that most of these, or we can't say that all of these movies were references in the Zodiac Killer's world or influences on the Zodiac Killer some way, somehow, but I do not want to downplay the possibility of inspirations, or when you see something you're like, maybe he got it from this movie. I do not want to downplay that, because I'll talk about a contemporary case, and that is the story of Bryan Kohberger, one that is fading away from the media. But after Bryan Kohberger committed the Idaho 4 murders, he was seen in the bathroom. I mean, he posted this online. He took a photo of himself in his bathroom wearing a button-up shirt, and there appears to be a shower with no visible shower curtain. And after this photo came out, like right when it first was published, I, of course, on Black Box Online Radio said it looks disgusting, and I stand by that, mind you. But there was a channel out there called Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi who was saying, oh, could this be a reference to Psycho or American Psycho? I mean, you have Psycho with the shower and American Psycho with the neat clothing. And I was just sitting back and thinking, what is this guy talking about? What are people talking about? It's just a photo of him in the shirt. Yeah, he happens to be standing in the bathroom, but a reference to Psycho, a reference to American Psycho. In the movie American Psycho, Christian Bale plays a serial killer called Patrick Bateman, and he likes to wear suits, specifically Valentino suits. He often wears button-up shirts and ties, and I'm like, well, I mean, obviously it's a button-up shirt, but doesn't necessarily look like any scene from American Psycho. Well, it turned out that I was wrong, and I will admit it. I will admit it. Because Ashley Banfield did a recent podcast where she just revealed Bryan Kohberger's image search history, and it was filled with images of American Psycho, not just the movie clips, but also images. It's like looking at pictures of Christian Bale in that movie playing the serial killer Patrick Bateman, so it's highly probable that that selfie was a reference to the movie American Psycho. And when we're looking at movies and you're thinking, oh, could that have been an inspiration on the Zodiac Killer? It's possible. The movie While the City Sleeps from 1956 is one that tells the story of the hunt for a serial killer, but it does it in a different way. It's told from the point of view of the media players. And I don't just mean reporters trying to track down the story and the scoop. I mean, we're talking about media executives are even involved in these discussions, and they're looking for a serial killer called the Lipstick Killer. Now, this is not relevant to the actual lipstick murders that William Hirons was convicted for, although a lot of people believe that he was innocent. Instead, this story is a serial killer who is stalking women. He's a home invader. He starts out killing by night, but then the news puts out a broadcast where they're making a taunt to the killer where they're saying, oh, you think you're smart? You think you're clever? Well, we know that you're a man. We know that you have brown hair because you left hairs behind at the crime scene. We've estimated that you're 20 years old. And the killer actually is around 20 years old, and he just starts like going from like elation to misery real fast, like, oh no, like his heart was just sinking. And they also theorize that he was a psychotic mama's boy who had a bad relationship with women, resentment for women, but his mother was also extremely passive and susceptible to his manipulations and didn't control his behavior, and all of that was true. He was somebody who lived with his mother took care of him, he worked a late job making deliveries for a drugstore, so he was out till about 4 o'clock in the morning every night, and that's when the crimes occurred. But their observations were so spot on that the killer escalated his behaviors. At first, he's already doing this, and this is the stuff that is the most relevant to the Zodiac, and he is thinking, okay, I'm going to commit the crimes differently each time. Have just a little bit of difference in each of the murders. And he also leaves behind clues at each murders. At one murder, he left behind a comic book called The Strangler, but he didn't do that every time. And then, one of the absolute biggest things that stood out to me was they're talking about how this killer only operates at night. Michael F. even wrote that in the email. And then they're thinking, well, if he's changing up his behaviors, what's he going to do next? Maybe he'll commit a crime in broad daylight. And what did the Zodiac Killer do? After Lake Herman Road, after Blue Rock Springs, those crimes were committed at night. Then we have Lake Berryessa in the daytime. He's changing things up so he will confuse the authorities. All of that stuff is in the movie While the City Sleeps. And again, this is the hunt for a serial killer from the point of view of media executives and newspaper men and the people who work for the TV stations. And it starts with the movie starts with a media tycoon who passes away, but when they are hunting for this serial killer, it's the way that they're thinking about this, the way that they're showing these types of taunts in the media, trying to bait the killer into doing something, but in reality, that's a giant game of mental chess. And, well, I mean, I don't like to give away spoilers, but there are just so many things in that film that show that the Zodiac could have been using it as an inspiration, playbook, or just kind of like some food for thought, because I don't think there are any specific references to While the City Sleeps from 1956 in the Zodiac's writings, and it's not what the Zodiac said, it's how he acted. And it shows that he would be the type of person to get inspiration from comic books, but not all the time. He might have a plan to commit crimes by night because it's convenient, but not all the time. He has to do one in the daylight to confuse people. And how about with the murder of Paul Stine? He's then going to commit a murder of a taxi driver because nobody will expect him to do that, no matter whom your suspect is. What do you think about that? And thank you to Michael F. for the movie recommendation, While the City Sleeps, from 1956. What do you think about any of the comments made about the murder of Paul Stine? And also, please feel free to check out the new shows. This is the Zodiac speaking on Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, and the Chronicle on Zodiac Theory. And that's all for me now, and I will see you guys tomorrow for a new episode on the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Good